As you settle in and prepare to drift off, imagine the world centuries ago, a world where the soft glow of candlelight was the only relief from nightfall, where the rustling of trees or the echo of coughing in a narrow alley told stories no one could explain. Tonight, we'll be traveling back into that world, not one of kings and battles, but of aches and fevers, of quiet struggles and whispered prayers. We're going to explore what it meant to be ill in a time before medicine as we know it. There were no antibiotics, no X-rays, no stethoscopes or hospital beds with crisp white sheets. People lived and suffered in an age where the causes of illness were a mystery, and healing was often more hopeful than helpful. They relied on rituals, herbs, saints, and sweat. Sometimes they recovered. Often, they didn't. But through it all, life moved on, slowly, carefully, rhythmically. And that's how we'll move through this story too. Gently. Thoughtfully. Quietly. Let your mind wander through cobbled streets and smoky hearths, through healing gardens and humble huts. Let the past soothe you to sleep as we begin our journey into a world without modern medicine. Our first stop will take us into the daily rhythm of the ill in a medieval village, where a cough wasn't just a cough, but the beginning of rituals, remedies, and reflection. Imagine yourself waking in a small wooden cottage. The roof creaks softly above you, thatched with straw. A sliver of light leaks through the wooden shutter. Morning has come. But your body feels heavy. There's a warmth behind your eyes, a weight in your chest. You are sick. In our world today, we might reach for a thermometer, a phone to call the doctor, a bottle of medicine on the shelf. But here, in a medieval village nestled beside a forest, you reach for a different kind of comfort, a hot compress made from warmed stones wrapped in cloth, a bowl of thick barley porridge, a whispered prayer to Saint Sebastian. Your mother, or perhaps your wife, moves quietly around the room. She knows the signs. She's seen fevers like this before. A wet cloth is pressed to your brow. Water is fetched, sometimes steeped with dried herbs gathered during the summer, elderflower for sweats, yarrow for fevers, mint for the stomach. The cottage smells of wood smoke and damp wool. Chickens cluck beyond the door. Outside, life goes on, bread must still be baked, the cow milked, the well water drawn. But for you, today is spent in bed. Not because it's expected, but because there's simply no strength to stand. In the early centuries, especially before the scientific revolution, illness wasn't separated from daily life. It was woven into it. Most people had no concept of contagion or germs. Illness could be sent by spirits, punished by God, or caused by the imbalance of humors, those for mystical fluids believed to govern the body: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. When someone in the family fell ill, they weren't rushed to a clinic. They stayed where they were. Bed rest wasn't a prescription, but a necessity. The bed itself was perhaps a straw-filled sack on the floor. Blankets might be sparse. Warmth, precious. And the remedies? They came from the local wise woman or from traditions passed down by word of mouth. A poultice made of mashed onions and lard. A draught brewed with nettles or horehound. Honey stirred into vinegar. Fennel to ease digestion. Leeks and garlic mashed into a pungent paste. Yet, illness wasn't always feared as we might fear it today. There was an acceptance, resigned but calm, that sickness was part of the cycle. Children often grew sick with colds and fevers, not all recovered. Old age, when reached, brought with it rheumatism, poor eyesight, aching joints. And those who couldn't walk far anymore simply stayed closer to the fire. In some homes, you might find a small religious icon near the bed. A wooden carving of a virgin or a tiny lead token from a pilgrimage to a healing shrine. The ill would clasp it, not in desperation, but in quiet faith. Prayers were whispered to Saint Roch, to Saint Apollonia for tooth pain, or to Saint Lucy for eye afflictions. Outside the home, in the village square, someone might notice your absence. But there was no formal system of concern. Neighbors might bring soup or a cloth soaked in rosemary water, but life didn't pause. Death was always nearby, and so illness, in a way, was expected. Still, communities weren't cold. There was warmth in how people cared for each other, through small gestures. A neighbor might tend your fire. A child might bring eggs. A cousin might recite prayers aloud beside your bed, even if you were too weary to respond. And while they lacked modern medicine, they did not lack comfort. In fact, the rhythm of daily life with illness had its own rituals. The careful spooning of broth, the turning of bed linens, the muttering of incantations believed to draw out sickness. Rest was everything. The body was believed to heal itself, if helped. And help came not with syringes, but with silence. Stillness. Warmth. Herbal steam. And time. Some people recovered. Some didn't. But even death was viewed differently. It was not always tragic. It was natural. An end, not a rupture. Many were buried in the clothes they wore in life, wrapped in shrouds, blessed with prayers. And the village moved on, quietly, rhythmically, like the seasons. As you imagine the slow turning of life in that village, think of the smell of peat smoke, the sound of a ladle stirring a clay pot, the feel of linen cloth warmed by fire. This was how the sick were cared for, not with precision, but with presence. Imagine now a figure emerging from the mist of a cobbled street. His silhouette is tall, strangely curved. He walks slowly, purposefully, through a city gripped by silence. The air is thick, not just with the scent of burning herbs and tallow smoke, but with dread. As he comes into focus, you see the beaked mask, the wide-brimmed hat, the long, waxed cloak. This is the plague doctor. But what did he truly do? And how did he live? To understand this figure, half healer, half omen, we must step carefully into the world of early modern Europe. The 14th to 17th centuries saw repeated waves of plague, bubonic, pneumonic, and septicemic, each leaving behind quiet streets, shuttered windows, and mourning. With no understanding of bacteria or rats, people turned to tradition, belief, and whatever tools they had. The plague doctor was one such tool. He was not a miracle worker. He was not even, often, a trained physician. In fact, many plague doctors were municipal hires, sometimes young, inexperienced medical students or older men who had little other employment. The towns needed someone, anyone, willing to face the infected, and so the plague doctor became a fixture. Their most striking feature, of course, was the costume. The beaked mask, now so iconic, was designed to protect. The beak itself was filled with strong-smelling herbs, lavender, camphor, rose petals, mint, cloves, meant to filter out a miasma, the bad air believed to carry the disease. Over time, layers of waxed leather, gloves, boots, and glass eye openings were added. To us, it may look theatrical. To them, it was the closest thing to a barrier between life and death. A plague doctor's day was structured yet strange. He might be tasked with visiting the infected in their homes, marking houses for quarantine, or estimating the number of dead. He carried a wooden stick, not to strike, but to examine patients without touching them. Sometimes, he used it to lift bedclothes or gently turn a body, distancing himself from the possibility of touch. And while some records suggest that they treated the sick, applying leeches, bleeding veins, administering herbal concoctions, their work was largely observational. They recorded symptoms, counted bodies, and bore witness to the ebb and flow of pestilence. Imagine the rhythm of his life. Waking in a small rented room near the edge of the city. pulling on the heavy layers of his gear, stepping out into empty streets where even birdsong had quieted. His breath slow within the mask, his vision fogged by the tiny glass circles before his eyes, the sound of his boots echoing softly on stone. Some people welcomed him, desperate for help. Others feared him, believing the doctor carried death itself, or marked homes for sorrow. Children might cry at the sight of him. Adults might beg or recoil. And yet, each day, he walked the city, recording names, symptoms, and dates in a worn leather-bound book. Many plague doctors died. Some from plague, others from exhaustion or exposure. But many survived. Partly thanks to their protective garb, partly due to sheer luck. Despite their associations with death, plague doctors did not perform autopsies or surgery. Their tools were often limited: small knives, cloth soaked in vinegar, handwritten treatises from older physicians. Their best remedies were often isolation, fumigation, and faith. They worked for months, sometimes years, until the plague ebbed, fading like a fever. When it did, some doctors vanished. Others remained, their masks packed away, their names etched into local records. We must remember that for the people of the time, these doctors were not symbols of hope or science. They were silent witnesses, couriers of sadness, markers of the strange boundary between the living and the dead. And yet, beneath the layers and masks, they were human. They ate simple meals, slept fitfully, and wrote letters to loved ones. Some even wrote journals describing what they saw, not with horror, but with weary calm. One doctor in France wrote of a city wrapped in fog and grief, where time moves not by bells, but by burials. Now imagine again that figure walking home in the dusk. He passes shuttered stalls. A black cat darts beneath a cart. Somewhere, a door opens and closes, and the echo lingers. He steps inside, removes his mask, and exhales. His job was not to cure, but to endure. As we leave him behind, the memory of his footsteps still echoing in the alleys of the mind, we move on, not to another doctor, but to the mysterious beliefs and cultural practices that sprang up around illness. In the next segment, we'll explore how people across centuries explain sickness, not with science, but with stars, saints, and spirits. Now imagine a clear night in the highlands, somewhere far from city lights. The sky above is awash with stars, quiet, unmoving, eternal. In a time before germ theory, before microscopes or laboratories, many believed the secrets of sickness lay in the heavens. Tonight, we drift into a world not of medicines, but of meanings, where disease was read in the stars, cast from the spirits, or sent by divine will. A world where to be ill was not simply a misfortune, but a message. For most of human history, illness was not merely a physical problem. It was symbolic, spiritual, even moral. Across ancient Mesopotamia, Greece, India, China, and Europe, people sought patterns, some in the alignment of planets, others in the behaviors of ancestors, or the disturbance of natural balance. Let us begin with astrology. In many medieval and ancient societies, physicians were trained astrologers. To diagnose an illness, a healer might consult the stars, drawing up a natal chart, calculating planetary positions, and determining which celestial body had fallen out of favor. Saturn might bring melancholy, Mars a fever, Venus diseases of the skin. An imbalance in the heavens was thought to reflect an imbalance within. Imagine an ill man in Florence, around the year 1400. He lies in bed, weakened. His family sends for the physician, who arrives with not just herbs but also star charts and a brass astrolabe. He studies the sky and pronounces, Venus is in opposition to Mars, there is heat in the blood, and the liver is disturbed. Treatment might then involve a cooling diet, bloodletting under a specific moon phase, or prayers timed to favorable hours. In other places, The cause of illness was spiritual, an invisible force, a punishment, or a wandering soul. Among the ancient Egyptians, illness was sometimes seen as the work of malevolent gods or disturbed spirits. Healing might involve incantations, rituals, or the wearing of protective amulets. The sick might be taken to temples, where priests would perform rites of cleansing, offer sacrifices, or write healing words on papyrus to be burned or worn. Even in later medieval Europe, spiritual causes held sway. Illness could be sent by God as punishment for sin, or permitted as a test of faith. The book of Job tells of a righteous man afflicted with sores and suffering, not for wrongdoing, but as a divine mystery. To be sick, then, was not only a bodily trial, but a moral and cosmic one. Imagine the comfort, in some ways, of this belief. Illness had meaning. It wasn't random or cruel, it had purpose. A fever might be the sign of an unbalanced soul. A rash, the mark of unconfessed sin. And so healing didn't always begin with herbs or poultices. It began with confession, with prayer, with pilgrimage. In many towns, sacred shrines and holy wells were believed to have healing properties. Pilgrims traveled great distances to touch the bones of a saint, to drink blessed water, or to sleep beside a sacred relic. The ill might carry a lead badge in the shape of St. Thomas's hand or a scallop shell from Santiago, hoping for divine intervention. And then there were the folk beliefs. Quiet, whispered traditions passed down from mother to daughter, from old men by the fire to curious boys. In some villages, it was believed that a sickness could be drawn out of the body by placing bread on the chest, or by burying a nail in the ground to pin the illness down. In Scandinavia, spirits called huldras were believed to cause lingering illness, especially if their forest homes had been disturbed. In Eastern Europe, the evil eye was blamed for sudden weakness or unexplained pains. Protection charms were tied to children's cradles, eyes were painted on homes, and blessings were murmured over sickly infants. Even the sounds of illness had meanings. A dog howling at night? An omen. A raven circling a chimney? A sign. And dreams, especially of blood, teeth, or water, could foretell illness before the first symptom appeared. But these mystical systems weren't born of ignorance. They were frameworks, ways for people to understand the inexplicable. When the body failed and the healer's remedies did not work, the mind sought explanation. And so it looked upward, inward, beyond. As time moved forward, so did ideas. But the old beliefs did not disappear. Even into the 19th century, some midwives still carried lucky coins. Some doctors still avoided certain procedures under certain stars. Some families still whispered prayers in the dark when fever returned. And perhaps even today, we retain a bit of that instinct. When we fall ill, we still ask why. We search for reasons. We look for patterns. We try to assign meaning. As we leave this world of mysticism and faith, our path takes us toward more tangible things, still ancient, still mysterious, but touchable: relics, bones, herbal jars, and ruined hospitals. In the next segment, we'll wander into the realm of medical archaeology, uncovering what the dead have left behind, and what their bones whisper about how they once lived and died without medicine. And so we leave the cottage now, stepping softly through the dew-damp grass, following the trail of our story toward its next chapter, where we'll explore a figure whose life was shaped not just by illness, but by the limits of healing. Beneath layers of soil and time, in the silence of forgotten graveyards and crumbled towns, the past waits quietly. Archaeology offers us more than artifacts and pottery. It gives us the silent testimony of those who once lived and suffered. In this segment, we will journey into burial grounds, ancient hospitals, and skeletal remains to uncover what the dead can tell us about illness in a world before medicine. Imagine a dig site in the English countryside. The morning is misty, the grass still damp with dew. A small team of archaeologists carefully brushes away the earth from a skeleton buried beneath a collapsed church. The bones are fragile, discolored with age, but they hold stories. This particular individual, likely a woman in her 30s, shows signs of rickets, her leg bones slightly bowed, her joints swollen. It suggests a life of poor nutrition and little sunlight. Her teeth, worn and pitted, bear the marks of childhood illness and long-term malnutrition. She did not die suddenly. She lived with sickness, perhaps quietly, stoically, for years. Across the world, similar stories lie beneath the surface. In a Roman cemetery near York, skeletons show evidence of tuberculosis, curved spines, fragile ribs, bones worn thin by the slow march of infection. The disease spread quietly through crowded homes and urban slums, long before anyone understood how. In these remains, the inflammation is frozen in time. There is no visible struggle, just the stillness of long endurance. Medical archaeology often involves more than bones. Sometimes, it's the grave goods that speak. In some medieval graves, small jars of herbs have been found, sealed beside the dead. In others, iron scissors or protective charms suggest the individual may have been a healer or believed in the need for spiritual defense even in death. At a site in Denmark, archaeologists unearthed the remains of a small hospital built in the 1200s. The structure had wooden beds, some spaced with care to keep the sick apart. Beneath the floorboards, layers of ash suggest regular burning, an early form of sterilization. They found crude surgical tools, ceramic bowls still holding traces of plant matter, and bone needles used for stitching wounds or draining abscesses. Nearby, graves contained people buried with precision, many with signs of injury or illness, broken bones healed at odd angles, deformed joints, fused vertebrae. These weren't battlefield deaths, but the wear and tear of daily life, injuries never properly treated, conditions left to worsen over time. From these sites, we learn that ancient people did not simply suffer in ignorance. They adapted. In a Byzantine monastery, a room was found with carved wooden crutches, showing evidence of long use. In a Roman villa in Gaul, a mosaic floor depicts a physician treating a patient's leg, perhaps a way of preserving memory or honoring skill. But bones also tell us of inequality. In a cemetery outside an early medieval monastery, high-status individuals show little sign of manual labor or physical trauma. Their bones are straight, their teeth relatively well maintained. In contrast, the poor, buried in shallower graves, display arthritis, healed fractures, and signs of repetitive stress. Illness was shaped not just by biology, but by class. Children's graves often hold the saddest clues. In a Neolithic settlement in Anatolia, archaeologists found a child buried with a polished stone bead in one hand and a small clay animal in the other. His tiny ribs bore lesions, evidence of respiratory disease. In another grave, a baby was wrapped in linen and laid beside an adult, perhaps a mother who died from childbirth. These are the quiet echoes of lives cut short, and of those who tried to offer comfort even in death. Sometimes, it's not what's buried that speaks, but what's missing. In an old monastery hospital in southern France, excavations revealed a burial site with dozens of patients who had undergone amputations, legs, hands, sometimes both. The surgical tools found nearby were primitive: saws, knives, tongs. The bones show that many survived their procedures, at least for a while. Their ends are smooth, rounded, showing healing. These patients didn't just endure illness, they endured crude surgery, infection, and long recoveries, without anesthesia. And yet, they were buried with care. Graves were aligned, some marked with stones, others with carved wooden crosses. Death did not erase dignity. Archaeology allows us to reconstruct the rhythm of life through the fragments of death. In bones, we see how common conditions, like arthritis, abscesses, or tooth decay, were quietly endured. We find evidence of tumors, spine deformities, and diseases like leprosy and syphilis. Each discovery adds another thread to the fabric of understanding, helping us imagine a world where illness was not hidden behind hospital walls, but woven into the fabric of existence. As you picture these ancient remains, laid out in neat excavation squares, catalogued under quiet skies, remember that they are more than specimens. They were people. Farmers. Mothers. Children. Healers. They bore illness with no prescriptions, no hospitals, no certainty. And yet, they endured. Often in pain. Often in silence. But they endured. From here, we'll move from bones and burial sites to the quieter spaces of healing, herbal gardens, monastic apothecaries, and forest paths where knowledge of plants passed from generation to generation. In the next segment, we'll explore how people turned to nature, and to one another, when illness came. Let us now step away from graves and stone walls and into a garden, a small, enclosed patch of green, tucked behind a monastery or beside a rural cottage. The morning dew still clings to the leaves, and the scent of thyme, mint, and lavender floats on the cool breeze. This was the first pharmacy. The earth itself, rich with roots and leaves and bark, was the medicine chest for countless generations. Before pills, before injections, before the language of chemistry, healing came in the form of infusions, poultices, tinctures, and salves. These remedies were rooted in tradition, often passed down orally from elder to apprentice, from parent to child. Some were based on observation, some on belief, and many, remarkably, on genuine medicinal properties known long before science confirmed them. Imagine yourself walking with a herbalist through a medieval herb garden. She kneels beside a cluster of marigolds, calendula, and explains their use, the bright orange flowers steeped in oil, used to soothe wounds and reduce swelling. She moves next to the rosemary, its scent sharp and invigorating. It's used for memory, she says, and for headaches when brewed as a tea. These gardens were carefully planned. Each plant had its place and purpose. Yarrow, for bleeding. Valerian, for sleep. Comfrey, for broken bones. Sage, for sore throats and wisdom alike. And garlic, strong, smelly, revered, was used for infections long before antibiotics were known. In monasteries, monks became custodians of this knowledge. As part of their healing ministries, they cultivated extensive gardens and compiled herbals, illustrated manuals detailing the appearance, harvesting, and uses of plants. One such text, the Physica by Hildegard of Bingen, blended spiritual insight with botanical knowledge. It described the warmer nature of cinnamon, the dry properties of fennel, and the calming influence of lemon balm. The preparation of these remedies was deliberate, almost meditative. Dried herbs were hung in cool chambers, roots were ground with pestles, and oils were warmed over low flames. Remedies were tailored not just to the ailment, but to the temperament of the patient. Was their illness considered hot or cold, wet or dry? Balance was the goal. In rural villages, the wise woman or cunning man took on the healer's role. They knew which mushrooms were safe to eat, which barks to boil for pain, which leaves to crush into salves. Some remedies required not just ingredients, but ritual, plucking a plant at dawn, boiling it under a waxing moon, or burying part of it after use to seal the healing. Many of these practices wove together belief and biology. A headache might be treated with willow bark, rich in the compound that would one day become aspirin. A stomach illness could be eased with chamomile or peppermint. Even during the plague, herbalists recommended burning juniper, myrrh, or frankincense to cleanse the air. The healer's home often smelled strongly of these plants. A mixture of earthy roots, pungent oils, and drying leaves. Tools were simple. Wooden bowls, clay jars, linen pouches, and beeswax for binding salves. Glass was rare. Metal, even more so. Remedies were made in small batches, tailored to the moment. But herbal healing wasn't limited to the domestic space. Entire forests, moors, and riverbanks served as pharmacies. Nettles for joint pain grew along fences. Meadowsweet thrived in wet fields and was brewed for fevers. Elder trees, sacred in many traditions, offered blossoms for tea and berries for syrup. Some treatments were simple. A compress of cooled water infused with rose petals for tired eyes. A warm infusion of licorice root and honey for a hoarse throat. Others were complex, involving multiple ingredients layered together and taken over days or weeks. There was, too, an understanding of rest as medicine. The ill were often wrapped in wool and allowed to sleep near the hearth. Broth simmered all day, rich with marrow and herbs. Healing was not only about stopping disease, but about supporting the body's journey through it. It's worth noting that while many herbal remedies were effective, others were based on superstition. Some used animal parts, like ground beetles or powdered bone. Others relied on astrology, or chants spoken during preparation. But even in these rituals, there was care. A belief in the process. A desire to help. And not all knowledge was equal. Women, in particular, held much of this botanical wisdom, but were also at risk. In times of fear or suspicion, the same knowledge that helped others could be called witchcraft. Many midwives and herbalists were accused, feared, or ostracized for their skills. Healing was a gift, and sometimes a burden. Still, the rhythm of herbal medicine continued for centuries. It shaped how people thought about illness, not as a sudden enemy, but as an imbalance to be gently corrected. Nature was not feared, but trusted. Healing was not swift, but slow. Today, echoes of this practice remain. Many modern medicines are derived from the very plants our ancestors used: foxglove for heart conditions, poppy for pain relief, willow bark for inflammation. The roots of pharmacology were, quite literally, roots. As we leave the garden and its soft, fragrant breeze, we walk back into the human world. Into homes and towns where illness wasn't treated in isolation, but experienced as a shared burden. In the next segment, we'll explore how communities responded to sickness, how neighbors cared for one another, and how public health, in its earliest forms, began to emerge. Let us now step beyond the cottage, beyond the monastery, and into the heart of the village, the market square, the narrow alleys, the communal wells. In a world without modern hospitals, illness was not a private affair. It echoed through entire communities. It reshaped routines. It tested bonds. And sometimes, it brought people closer together in quiet, enduring ways. Imagine a small medieval town. Cobblestone streets meander between timbered houses. The sun has barely risen, but already the baker is kneading dough, the blacksmith is stoking his fire, and a child is being carried to the well, too weak to walk. Whispers pass from door to door: someone has fallen ill. A cough turned to fever. A household shuttered its windows. The town takes note, not with panic, but with preparation. In the absence of formal health systems, communities became the front line of response. Neighbors brought soup or bread, not out of obligation, but from shared experience. Illness was common, and care was informal but vital. If a parent grew weak, others watched the children. If a household couldn't reach the fields, someone else would turn the soil. This mutual dependence formed the backbone of pre-modern health resilience. Sometimes care came from kin, but often it came from everyone. In many European villages, parish almoners, church-appointed caregivers, were responsible for distributing food and basic aid to the sick. Donations of candles, cheese, or firewood were made on behalf of the unwell. At times, entire streets pooled money to help a neighbor afford a physician's visit if such a person was even nearby. There were also early forms of quarantine, not as we know it now, but improvised, imperfect solutions. During plague outbreaks, it was common for towns to mark infected homes with a painted cross or a piece of cloth hung outside. Families might be told to stay within for 40 days. Others left baskets of food near the door, exchanging silent glances from a safe distance. Fear was present, but so was cooperation. In larger towns and cities, early hospitals, more like almshouses, served as refuges for the sick poor. These weren't places of treatment, but of shelter. They offered a bed, bread, perhaps a broth. The goal wasn't always to heal, but to ease. The staff, often nuns or monks, cared for patients with calm detachment. They washed sores. They read aloud from scripture. They helped the dying find peace. One such place was the Hôtel Dieu in Paris, founded in the 7th century. It housed the sick, the elderly, and the destitute. Beds were shared, sometimes 2 or 3 to a mattress, with only curtains dividing patients. Ventilation was poor. Cleanliness was inconsistent. But there was compassion. And in a time with few alternatives, it was something. Beyond the cities, religious brotherhoods and sisterhoods often took on the task of tending to the ill. In Germany, the Alexian brothers cared for plague victims and buried the dead. In Italy, lay fraternities walked the streets with bells and carts, collecting the dying, comforting them with prayers, and tending to their final moments. Care could also be deeply local and deeply personal. A healer might be summoned not just for remedies, but for presence. A gentle voice. A familiar face. In some places, elderly women were called soul mothers. Not because they were midwives, but because they sat with the sick and the dying, guiding them quietly toward whatever came next. Yet not all communities reacted with compassion. At times, illness brought fear, suspicion, and division. Lepers were often expelled from towns, forced to live in separate colonies or wear bells to announce their presence. During the Black Death, foreign travelers, beggars, and Jewish communities were scapegoated, sometimes violently. Sickness could bring out both the best and the worst of society. But for every story of exclusion, there are dozens more of quiet kindness. A widow baking bread for a sick child next door. A village priest walking miles to visit the infirm. A cobbler's apprentice helping to carry water for an ill neighbor each morning, just as his own father had once been helped. Illness was part of life, and so too was care. It wasn't medicalized. It wasn't perfect. But it was human. Imagine, if you will, the rhythm of a town during a fever season. The sound of footsteps softening, the market a little quieter, the baker's hearth burning just as hot, but with more loaves set aside for those who couldn't come. There's a hush to the air. A slowness. But not a collapse. Life continued, gently altered. In some cultures, illness even brought the community together in celebration. In certain African and Middle Eastern societies, healing ceremonies involved music, food, and ritual. Illness was not shunned, but met with the full force of social energy, dancing, drumming, storytelling, herbs, and laughter. A reminder that the body, mind, and community were all connected. Even today, remnants of these community care traditions remain. The bringing of meals during illness. The gathering of neighbors after a loss. The quiet checking in. The candle in the window. We are not so far removed from those earlier rhythms as we may think. And now, as we leave the village and step into the stone walls of early hospitals and healing institutions, we begin to see the seeds of organization. In the next segment, we'll explore the origins of the hospital, not as we know it today, but as a place of shelter, of charity, and of early attempts to structure the act of healing. Let us now cross the stone threshold of one of the earliest institutions designed specifically for the care of the sick, the hospital. But erase from your mind the sterile halls, the beeping machines, the white-coated doctors of today. Instead, picture a dim, echoing chamber beneath a vaulted ceiling. Rows of straw mattresses line the walls. Some patients moan softly. Others lie still, their faces pale, wrapped in linen. The air smells of sweat, wine, vinegar, incense, and sometimes despair. This is not a place of cures, but of care. Welcome to the medieval hospital. The word hospital comes from the Latin hosps, meaning both guest and host. And at its heart, the medieval hospital was just that, a place where the sick and weary, the orphaned and dying, the lost and abandoned, could find a kind of hospitality. Often attached to monasteries or churches, early hospitals were less concerned with treating disease than with providing spiritual and physical comfort. They were places of mercy more than medicine. One of the oldest and most famous was the Hôtel Dieu in Paris, founded around the year 651 by Saint Landry, the Bishop of Paris. Its name meant Hostel of God. Located near the Cathedral of Notre Dame, the Hôtel Dieu became a model for hospital care across Europe. Inside, it was noisy, crowded, and often chaotic. Patients shared beds, sometimes 3 or 4 to 1. There were few windows and little ventilation. Illnesses mingled in the air. But there was food, there was shelter, and above all, there was care. Caregivers were typically religious figures, monks, nuns, or lay sisters. These were not physicians in a modern sense, but devoted attendants who believed they were serving Christ in every patient. They cleaned wounds, changed linens, spooned broth into open mouths, and prayed at bedsides. To die in a hospital was not always seen as a failure. It was often seen as an opportunity for the soul to be prepared, cleaned, and lifted into eternity. Hospitals had many shapes and purposes. Some specialized in the poor and infirm. Others focused on abandoned children or the elderly. Still others, like leper hospitals, were situated outside city walls, designed to isolate the contagious. In Byzantine Constantinople, hospitals sometimes included surgical wards, libraries, and even female physicians, though this level of advancement was rare in Western Europe. In Islamic societies, meanwhile, hospitals were often far more advanced. The Bimaristans of the Islamic Golden Age, places like the one in Baghdad founded by Caliph Harun al-Rashid, were remarkable. They had dedicated wards for different illnesses, records of patient histories, and salaried physicians trained in medical theory. They offered lectures to medical students, pharmacy services, and even music therapy. Patients stayed as long as needed, regardless of their ability to pay. These institutions were often open 24 hours, with staff rotating in shifts. But back in medieval Europe, the story was different. Resources were limited. Clean water was a luxury. Beds were often infested. Linen was reused. One sponge might clean many wounds. Bloodletting tools were seldom sterilized. Despite their spiritual mission, hospitals could be dangerous places. Infectious diseases ran rampant. Death was common. Yet they persisted, and even multiplied. By the 12th century, the Crusades had sparked a renewed interest in organized care. The Knights Hospitaller, a military and religious order, established hospitals along pilgrimage routes, especially in the Holy Land. These institutions combined martial discipline with charitable intent. They cared for Christian pilgrims and the wounded alike, blending battlefield triage with monastic nursing. In England, the reign of Henry II saw a boom in hospital building. Small spitals appeared in towns, often founded by guilds or wealthy patrons. Many were dedicated to particular saints, St. Leonard, St. John, St. Mary, and their chapels were just as important as their infirmaries. Here, care was considered a sacred act. Yet for all their spiritual significance, hospitals also served civic and political roles. They demonstrated a ruler's piety. They showcased a town's compassion. They functioned as social safety nets in a world without welfare. To build a hospital was to build prestige and moral authority. Let us not overlook the contradictions, though. Hospitals often refused the mentally ill, who were feared and misunderstood. Women were rarely treated unless they were nuns or prostitutes. Treatments, when they existed, were based on humoral theory and prayer, not science. And yet, something important was happening. In these dark, crowded spaces, the idea of institutional care was taking root. The hospital was evolving from a religious refuge to a civic necessity. By the late Middle Ages, some hospitals began keeping rudimentary records. They tracked patient outcomes. They wrote down symptoms and attempted treatments. They assigned space based on diagnosis, a critical, if clumsy, step toward modern medicine. One famous example is the Santa Maria Nuova Hospital in Florence, founded in 1288 by a wool merchant named Folco Portinari, the father of Dante's muse, Beatrice. The hospital kept careful accounts, employed both physicians and barbers, and became one of the most advanced in Europe for its time. Still, most hospitals were places of last resort. If you were a medieval peasant with an aching tooth or a swollen leg, you'd likely visit the local healer or barber surgeon before ever stepping foot into a hospital. The hospital was where you went when everything else had failed, or when you had nowhere else to go. It was a place of endings, of final prayers, of flickering candles and whispered Latin. And yet, there was dignity here. Amid the noise and discomfort, there was also mercy. Amid the ignorance, there was intention. And amid the suffering, there were hands, rough, calloused, devoted, doing their best. So as we leave the crowded wards of medieval hospitals behind, we turn our gaze to a quieter figure, the herbalist, the midwife, the village-wise woman. In our next segment, we'll explore the world of traditional remedies and plant-based healing, the medicine of roots, leaves, and ancient instinct. If you lived in a small medieval village and you developed a fever, a rash, or a mysterious swelling, where would you go? Not the hospital. Not a university-trained physician. No, your first stop would almost certainly be the local healer, a woman with weathered hands, a nose for herbs, and stories passed down through generations. She might be called a wise woman, an herbalist, a midwife, or, in darker times, a witch. This was medicine not of books, but of tradition. A knowledge rooted in the earth, in the rhythms of the seasons, in the language of plants and the quiet wisdom of bodies. Let us imagine her home. A low thatched cottage near the edge of the forest. Bundles of dried herbs hang from wooden beams, lavender, sage, yarrow, and rue. Jars line her shelves, filled with mysterious powders and pungent roots. A mortar and pestle sits on the table. The scent of boiling nettle fills the air. She welcomes you in with a nod and gently touches your wrist. She doesn't speak at first, just listens, to your cough, to your breathing, to the color of your cheeks. Her diagnosis is not based on Latin treatises, but on what her mother taught her, and her grandmother before that. She might prepare a tea of chamomile for anxiety, or a poultice of plantain leaves for a wound. For fevers, perhaps an infusion of willow bark, rich in salicin, an ancestor of aspirin. For infections, a salve of honey and garlic. If you were pregnant, she would know which herbs to avoid and which to embrace. For difficult births, she had techniques known only to midwives, positioning, prayers, and sometimes painful decisions. This knowledge was often more effective than we assume. Many medieval herbal remedies had real pharmacological power. Foxglove for heart conditions. Yew for pain. Poppy for sleep. Even now, modern pharmaceuticals owe much to these ancient practices. But this was not a science. It was a living art. Healers relied on trial, error, intuition, and, crucially, community memory. They passed their secrets by word of mouth. Written records were rare, and when they did exist, they were often compiled much later by male physicians who had collected information from women they would not credit. And yet, the line between healer and heretic was a thin one. During times of panic, plague, famine, stillbirths, the village healer might be praised one day and persecuted the next. Her connection to nature, her knowledge of birth and blood, her solitary power, these things both comforted and frightened medieval communities. The Church, too, often viewed unofficial healers with suspicion. Healing was, after all, considered a divine act. To tamper with the body without divine sanction risked accusations of sorcery. Midwives, in particular, were often targeted, not just because they handled life and death, but because they did so outside male authority. Despite this, many religious institutions relied heavily on women healers. Monastic infirmaries employed nuns skilled in herbal medicine. They kept herb gardens, copied medical texts, and treated the sick with balms and brews. The famous Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, composed detailed texts on healing, blending theology with plant-based medicine. She believed the natural world was imbued with divine healing energy, what she called viriditas, or greening power. But outside the monastery walls, village healing remained a patchwork of inherited lore. Let's look at some of the most common medieval remedies used by these traditional healers. Fennel for indigestion and flatulence. Elderberry for colds and flu. Nettle tea for arthritis. Comfrey for broken bones, its old name was nip bone. Valerian root for insomnia. Mandrake, highly toxic, was used in tiny doses as a sedative or anesthetic. Some remedies were harmless. Others were deadly. The line was often fine, and the knowledge required to walk it safely was immense. Healers also used symbolic practices, tying herbs in bundles, reciting prayers, chanting charms. These rituals weren't necessarily superstitious. They often served psychological and cultural roles, reinforcing belief in healing, instilling calm, or invoking divine protection. And then there were the remedies that defy all understanding. To treat jaundice, a healer might bury a live frog in a mud pot. To cure a fever, one might pass the patient through a split tree trunk. To protect a newborn, some communities smeared a paste of butter and ashes on the door. Were these magical rituals or primitive psychology? Perhaps both. The boundaries between medicine, magic, and religion were porous and constantly shifting. This folk medicine was deeply embedded in the rhythms of rural life. Seasonal harvests determined what remedies were available. The healer knew which root to dig in autumn, which blossom to pick at sunrise, which mushroom to avoid entirely. The local green spaces, meadows, woods, gardens, were as vital to medicine as any apothecary shop. And perhaps most importantly, these healers cared. They visited the sick. They watched over the dying. They listened to women's fears and men's complaints and children's cries. In many ways, they were the social and emotional heart of their communities. Still, as universities and city physicians grew in influence, traditional healers, especially women, were increasingly sidelined. Their knowledge was dismissed as backward or dangerous. Their methods were not written down in Latin, and so they were not trusted. And in the coming centuries, during the height of the witch hunts, many of these women would pay a terrible price for their skills. But for hundreds of years, they were the backbone of rural health. They kept communities alive, not with forceps and formulas, but with tea, touch, and tenderness. So, as we leave behind the herb-scented cottage of the village healer, we enter a darker room, the chambers of the barber-surgeon. Blades glint in candlelight. Blood spills. Teeth crack. Limbs are removed. In our next segment, we'll explore the most grisly corner of medieval medicine, or the barber's chair. Step into a narrow street in medieval London or Paris. The air smells of rotting fish, coal smoke, and sweat. Somewhere between the baker's stall and the tanner's workshop, you spot a striped red and white pole turning gently in the wind. This is not a barber shop in the modern sense. This is the barber surgeon's establishment, a place where you might get a haircut or an amputation. The striped pole? It symbolizes blood and bandages. The red for blood, the white for the linen used to staunch it, and the pole itself perhaps a reference to the stick a patient might grip while being bled. This was medicine meets mechanics, and it was messy, noisy, and not for the faint of heart. From beards to bones. In the early Middle Ages, surgeons were considered manual laborers, not real doctors. Learned physicians studied at universities, reading Arabic translations of Greek texts and debating humors. But they did not touch the body. That was seen as beneath their dignity. So who did? Barbers. They already had the tools, sharp blades, steady hands, experience with razors. Over time, their work expanded from trimming hair to pulling teeth, lancing boils, setting bones, stitching wounds, and performing basic surgeries. In some towns, barber surgeons were the only medical practitioners available to common people. Let's imagine a typical procedure. A man arrives with a festering wound. He might be held down by assistants, given a leather strap to bite, and then sliced open without anesthesia. The barber surgeon cleans the area with wine or vinegar, applies a hot iron to cauterize it, and wraps it in linen. With luck, the patient lives. If not, well, at least the infection didn't spread further. Amputations were horrifyingly common, especially after battlefield injuries. Without knowledge of antisepsis or germ theory, infections were deadly. To stop the spread of gangrene, limbs were cut off as quickly as possible, sometimes in under 2 minutes. The faster the cut, the better the chance of survival. Imagine the scene. The surgeon grips a curved knife, draws a circle around the limb, saws through flesh and bone, and applies a hot iron or tar to the stump. All without anesthetic. Patients sometimes died of shock before the bleeding could even be stopped. And yet, some survived. Enough for barber surgeons to continue practicing. In time, they developed surprisingly effective techniques, ligatures to tie off blood vessels, new saw designs, rudimentary prosthetics. They became respected craftsmen, if not equals to the academic physicians. Scales hashed the divide between surgeon and doctor. By the 13th century, a professional split was emerging. Physicians were educated in universities and worked with the wealthy elite. Surgeons were trained through apprenticeships and guilds. The two camps viewed each other with suspicion. Physicians mocked surgeons for their rough manners and hands-on approach. Surgeons accused physicians of being all theory and no practice. It was a classic brain versus brawn conflict, and patients often had to choose between learned advice and skilled cutting. Despite their crude methods, barber surgeons were crucial during wars. On battlefields, university doctors were rare, but barber surgeons were everywhere. They treated arrow wounds, reset dislocated joints, stitched sword gashes, and sometimes even removed embedded blades or splinters. Many soldiers owed their lives, or at least their stumps, to these gritty professionals. One famous barber surgeon was Ambrose Pare, a 16th-century Frenchman who served on battlefields across Europe. He rejected the use of boiling oil to cauterize wounds, common at the time, and instead used a gentle balm of egg yolk, oil of roses, and turpentine. When he saw that his patients healed faster and with less agony, he became a pioneer in compassionate care. Pare also reintroduced the use of ligatures in amputations, tying off arteries rather than burning them shut. His work helped push surgery forward and showed that barber surgeons could also be innovators. Surgeries, extractions, and everything in between. Let's look at the range of procedures a typical barber surgeon might perform. Bloodletting, using a lancet or fleam to open a vein, often at the elbow or ankle. Believed to balance the humors. Cupping, placing heated glass cups on the skin to draw out bad blood. Tooth pulling, done with forceps or even bare hands. No anesthesia, of course. Wound treatment, cleaning, stitching, and dressing with honey, wine, or oil. Boil lancing, infected boils were sliced open and drained. Cataract couching, a sharpened needle was used to push the cloudy lens of the eye downward. The patient was usually blinded afterward, but sometimes slightly less so. Trepanation, drilling a hole in the skull to relieve pressure or let out evil spirits. Shockingly, some survived. The conditions were rough. The tools were basic. But barber surgeons operated in a world without antibiotics, germ theory, or anesthetics. They did the best they could with what they had, and sometimes they truly helped. And while they weren't always respected by elite physicians, the common people knew who they could turn to in times of injury or emergency. It was the man with the razor, the saw, and the stained apron. #wrench training and reputation. Unlike university-trained physicians, barber surgeons learned their trade through apprenticeships. A boy might begin at age 12, cleaning instruments, sweeping floors, and watching procedures. Over the years, he would learn anatomy by observing, by practicing on animals, and sometimes by dissecting corpses, often illegally. Guilds regulated their work, set standards, and provided licenses. In some cities, such as London and Paris, barber surgeons formed their own prestigious companies. They developed manuals, shared techniques, and even published illustrations showing how to perform operations. These manuals, often filled with diagrams of the human body, represented some of the earliest attempts to systematize surgical knowledge. Though crude by modern standards, they were milestones in the history of medicine. Coffin hash between pain and progress. Still, let's not romanticize it. For every successful surgery, there were countless failures. Barber surgeons operated in filthy conditions, with unsterilized tools and no concept of infection control. Many patients died from sepsis, shock, or sheer blood loss. Pain was a constant, and compassion was not always present. But without these rough-handed pioneers, the art of surgery might never have advanced. They opened the body when others feared to. They took risks, learned from failures, and slowly, sometimes agonizingly, pushed the boundaries of what could be done. Their legacy lives on not just in the operating room, but in the very symbol of their trade, the red and white barber's pole. From here, our journey turns toward one of the strangest corners of medieval medicine, where astrology ruled, dreams diagnosed, and physicians looked to the stars for answers. In the next segment, we'll explore medical astrology and magical beliefs, where Saturn might cause your toothache and Venus might cure your melancholy. Picture a medieval physician standing by a patient's bedside, not with a stethoscope, but with an astrolabe in hand. Before touching the patient, before even asking questions, the physician looks skyward. What is the position of Mars today? Is Saturn in opposition? What does the patient's birth chart say about their susceptibility to phlegmatic imbalance? Welcome to the surreal and symbolic world of medical astrology, where healing was written not just in the body, but in the heavens. In the Middle Ages, medicine and astrology were inseparable. Nearly every respected doctor owned a chart of the zodiac, a star map, and a set of texts on celestial influence. The stars didn't just guide fate, they guided medicine. Let's gently stroll into this celestial practice. The Zodiac Man, a cosmic blueprint for health. One of the most iconic images in medieval manuscripts is that of the Zodiac Man. In this drawing, the human body is overlaid with the 12 signs of the zodiac. Aries governs the head. Taurus the neck. Gemini the arms and lungs. Cancer the chest. Leo the heart. Virgo the abdomen. Libra the kidneys. Scorpio the genitals. Sagittarius the thighs. Capricorn the knees. Aquarius the calves. Pisces the feet. This wasn't a metaphor. Physicians and surgeons literally used the positions of the planets to determine when to treat which part of the body. If the moon was in Taurus, you did not perform surgery on the neck. If Mars was in Leo, you avoided the heart. It was believed that doing otherwise would disturb the cosmic harmony and cause the patient's condition to worsen. The moon was especially powerful. Its phase could affect bleeding, swelling, and recovery. Bloodletting was avoided during a full moon but encouraged during a waning crescent. These rules were taught in medical schools and were part of every physician's toolset. Milky Way planetary personalities and their effects. Medieval thinkers associated each planet with certain qualities, both physical and emotional. Mars, hot and dry. Causes fevers, bleeding, and warlike behavior. Saturn, cold and dry. Brings melancholy, depression, and chronic illness. Jupiter, warm and moist. Encourages growth and optimism. Venus, warm and moist. Linked to fertility, love, and the reproductive system. Mercury, neutral but changeable. Affects nerves, speech, and intellect. Moon, cool and moist. Controls fluids, emotions, and cycles. Sun, hot and dry. Powers the heart and gives vitality. Each person was thought to be born under the influence of certain planets. A choleric patient, prone to anger and fever, might be ruled by Mars. A melancholic soul, thin and quiet, may be under Saturn's sway. Physicians considered these traits when prescribing treatments. Thus, astrology wasn't separate from medicine, it was part of diagnosis. Bedhash dreams and divine diagnosis. In an age before lab tests and imaging, dreams could be as valuable as symptoms. Both physicians and laypeople believed that dreams carried clues, not just from the subconscious, but from divine or cosmic sources. If you dreamed of snakes, perhaps you had a stomach parasite. If you saw muddy water, your bile might be imbalanced. A dream of flying could signal mental agitation or even a windy humor affecting the brain. Monastic infirmaries recorded patients' dreams as part of their treatment. Sometimes, saints or angels appeared in dreams to offer remedies or predictions. In one tale from the 12th century, a monk dreamt of Saint Cuthbert handing him a balm to heal his festering leg wound. Upon waking, he recreated the balm with herbs he remembered from the vision, and his leg improved. For the illiterate or poor, dream interpretation by a village healer might be the only medical consultation they ever received. Sparkles the prognostica, predicting death by the stars. Physicians often used astrology to predict the outcome of an illness. These predictions were called prognostica, and they were taken very seriously. If a patient fell ill during a lunar eclipse, or if Mars was in opposition to Saturn, the prognosis was grim. A favorable alignment of Jupiter and Venus might suggest recovery. The physician would consult the patient's nativity chart, a map of the heavens at the moment of their birth, alongside a horary chart, which depicted the stars at the time the illness began. Together, these tools helped determine whether the patient would recover or perish. While we might scoff at this today, for medieval people it brought comfort. If the stars decreed your fate, then suffering was not random, it was part of the cosmic order. Medical magic and healing amulets. Astrology often overlapped with magical medicine. Talismans, chants, and astrological amulets were widespread. A common treatment for fevers was to wear a lead plate inscribed with astrological symbols. Others wore rings bearing the sign of Jupiter to protect the liver, or the symbol of Venus for fertility. These objects were sometimes consecrated during certain moon phases, believed to harness celestial power. In monasteries, monks sometimes copied medical grimoires, which combined herbal remedies with invocations of angels, planets, and saints. A recipe to cure epilepsy might involve herbs, but also writing a charm on parchment under the light of a waxing moon. To modern minds, these blendings of science and superstition seem irrational. But they were based on observation, tradition, and an intense desire to bring order to illness. Medicine or magic? The line between medicine and magic was blurry. Consider this scenario. A peasant comes to the village wise woman with a fever. She consults the stars and declares that Mars is causing the illness. She gives him a charm to wear and a bitter tea of feverfew and willow bark. The man recovers. Was it the charm? The herb? The alignment of Mars? The placebo effect? Or simple coincidence? In medieval Europe, it didn't matter. What mattered was healing, and if the stars played a part, so be it. Scroll astrology in universities and hospitals. Even in formal medical schools, like those at Salerno, Montpellier, and Bologna, students were taught astrology. The curriculum included Ptolemy's Tetrabiblos, which explained how celestial movements influence the natural world. Hospitals employed astrologers or consulted charts before major procedures. In England, King Edward III had a royal physician who practiced astrology. Even Pope Sixtus IV consulted star charts before launching political decisions. The practice wasn't fringe. It was mainstream science, rooted in a worldview where everything, body, mind, heavens, was interconnected. Shooting star a fading star. By the late 1500s, as anatomy improved and empirical science gained ground, astrology began to lose its prestige. Astronomers like Copernicus and Galileo challenged the Earth-centered cosmos that medieval astrology relied upon. Slowly, the medical profession turned toward observation, dissection, and experimentation. Still, astrology lingered. Even into the 17th century, physicians like William Lilly and Simon Forman kept detailed astrological diaries, treating thousands of patients with a blend of herbs, charms, and celestial charts. Today, we may not consult the moon when scheduling surgery. But the fascination with star signs, personality types, and cosmic influence hasn't entirely disappeared. The medieval mindset still echoes in horoscopes, dream books, and the allure of alternative medicine. And so, as we leave this starlit chapter of medicine, we head toward one of its most misunderstood branches, mental illness and madness. In the next segment, we'll explore how the Middle Ages tried to explain, restrain, or cure those afflicted by invisible torment, from melancholic scholars to accused witches and lunatics under the moon's sway. Let us now turn our attention to those often overlooked in the grand scrolls of medical history, women. In the absence of formalized medicine, women across the ancient and medieval worlds played an indispensable role as caretakers, herbalists, and midwives. Their knowledge was rarely written down, but instead passed orally from mother to daughter, grandmother to granddaughter, generation to generation. Within their hands and hearts lay a tradition of healing that was as vital as it was quiet. Imagine yourself in a small Saxon village nestled in the woods. A low thatched house stands at the edge of the tree line, smoke curling from its chimney. Inside, the light is soft and flickering. Dried herbs dangle from beams above, their scents mingling in the cool air. Lavender, sage, chamomile, and mugwort. This is the domain of the village healer, often an elderly woman who knows not only which plants to pick and when, but also the cycles of the moon, the meaning of a cough's timbre, the warning signs of difficult childbirth. These women relied on a deep empirical knowledge of the natural world. Willow bark for fevers and aches, comfrey for broken bones and bruises, yarrow to stop bleeding, garlic to fight infection. They observed what worked, over years, over lives, and they taught others through doing, not prescribing. In many places, their authority in matters of health was unquestioned, not because of prestige or title, but because of familiarity and trust. Midwifery, in particular, was a sacred calling. In societies where childbirth was as dangerous as war, the midwife was a guide through the veil, ushering life in and sometimes, tenderly, accompanying it out. They understood positioning, pressure, signs of trouble. They knew to apply warm compresses, when to ease labor with gentle herbs, and how to comfort a mother in agony or mourning. And when complications arose beyond their skill, they would offer prayers, whispered with steady hands and hearts weighed by helplessness. But their knowledge, however essential, was precariously placed in societies dominated by male hierarchies. As universities rose and medicine became a formal profession, largely closed to women, these age-old female traditions were increasingly dismissed as folk knowledge, or worse, associated with superstition and witchcraft. Indeed, many women who were healers and midwives would, in time, face accusations of sorcery simply because they knew too much or cured too many. In some regions of medieval Europe, the line between medicine and magic blurred entirely. A midwife might speak a charm over a mother in labor, not because she believed it conjured power, but because words had weight, and the rhythm of a whispered chant could soothe even when herbs could not. Healing, in this world, was as much about the soul and the spirit as it was about the flesh. Consider also the blend of practicality and ritual that defined these healing practices. A poultice wasn't simply applied, it might be laid with prayer, or bound with a red string believed to ward off evil. An herbal tea brewed for a cough might be stirred in a sunwise direction to invite health. These were not meaningless flourishes but expressions of a world view in which the natural, the spiritual, and the emotional were tightly interwoven. Even in larger towns and cities, where male physicians were present, it was often the women, wives, mothers, and neighbors, who provided the first and most consistent care. They nursed the sick, bathed the dying, kept watch through fevered nights. Their contributions were rarely honored with titles or preserved in texts, but they were, and remain, the heartbeat of human healing. As we reflect on these women, their quiet strength, their patient learning, and their gentle rituals, we find a reminder of healing that is deeply human. Not merely about the treatment of symptoms, but about the offering of presence, of knowledge, of care passed from hand to hand, soul to soul. And now, with that image gently in your thoughts, the flickering hearth, the smell of drying herbs, the soft voice of a midwife at dusk, we move onward, toward more organized responses to illness in the era of monasteries, where healing and holiness intertwined in quiet, candlelit corridors. As we leave behind the wooded cottage of the wise woman, we find ourselves walking under high stone arches, the air cool and hushed, the scent of beeswax and old vellum lingering. We have entered a different kind of healing space, the medieval monastery. During the early Middle Ages, long before hospitals as we know them existed, monasteries served as the beating heart of organized healthcare across much of Europe. These religious communities were not only centers of prayer and scripture but also of learning, farming, brewing, and yes, healing. The Rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century, emphasized care for the sick as a sacred duty. In Benedictine monasteries, every monk was expected to see Christ in the ill and to provide care not only as an act of charity but as a core aspect of spiritual life. Before all things and above all things, care must be taken of the sick, the rule instructs. And thus, monks and nuns across the continent built infirmaries, cultivated herb gardens, and copied medical manuscripts with the same reverence they gave the Psalms. Let us imagine, then, a monastery nestled in the hills of Burgundy. A stone cloister surrounds a quiet courtyard where lavender and rosemary grow. Beyond that lies the herbarium, the monastic garden meticulously maintained not for beauty, but for healing. Rows of medicinal plants line the paths: fennel, rue, betony, horehound, wormwood, all labeled in Latin, tended by hand, and recorded in simple herbal texts. The monastery's infirmarian, perhaps a monk with years of experience, knows just where to gather leaves for a tonic or how to steep a bitter brew to ease digestive pains. Inside the infirmary, patients lie on straw mattresses covered with linens, some freshly laundered by novices. The walls are whitewashed, the windows open to catch fresh air, and the mood is solemn but gentle. A monk might bring a basin of warm water to wash a feverish brow or sit in quiet prayer beside a dying brother. The focus was not only on extending life but on easing suffering and preparing the soul for its journey beyond. Monastic medicine combined practical care with spiritual belief. Monks and nuns often used the writings of ancient physicians such as Galen and Hippocrates, translated and preserved carefully in Latin, alongside Christian theology. They believed in humors and bodily balance, but also in divine will and holy intercession. A poultice might be applied, followed by a prayer to Saint Raphael. A syrup might be sweetened with honey and blessed with the sign of the cross. Some monasteries became renowned for their healing skills. The Abbey of Monte Cassino in Italy, the Monastery of St. Gall in Switzerland, and later, Westminster Abbey in England, all had sophisticated medical facilities for their time. They maintained scriptoria where manuscripts were copied and illustrated, preserving not only medical knowledge but blending it with monastic insight. These texts, known as herbals, included instructions on identifying, cultivating, and using medicinal plants, often with curious illustrations of rootmen and mythical creatures mixed in. It is worth noting, however, that monastic medicine was primarily reserved for the monks themselves and, occasionally, wealthy patrons or nearby nobility. The poor might be turned away or offered only brief care at the gatehouse. Still, the example set by the monasteries laid the groundwork for later hospital foundations, especially as monastic charity expanded during times of famine, war, or plague. Even more fascinating is the overlap between spiritual rituals and healing. Holy relics were sometimes placed beside the sick. Pilgrims visited shrines seeking miracle cures. Monks believed that sin could cause illness, and confession might be prescribed alongside rest and herbal tea. Healing was an act of grace as much as it was of science. As centuries passed, monasteries became not only caretakers of the sick but of knowledge itself. While much classical medicine was lost in Western Europe during the early medieval period, it was through monastic scriptoria that bits and pieces were preserved, awaiting the resurgence of broader intellectual inquiry during the Renaissance. So, the next time you think of monks in quiet solitude, picture also the careful crushing of herbs in a mortar, the gentle washing of a wound, the soft whisper of a prayer over a sickbed. Picture knowledge handed down not in lecture halls but through patient practice, simple observation, and reverence for both body and soul. And now, with a candle flickering low in the monastery infirmary, let us move forward to the cities of the later Middle Ages, where medicine began to find its footing in universities and hospitals as the world changed once again. In the year 1347, something unimaginable arrived on European shores. It did not march with armies, nor roar like thunder, but it swept through towns and countryside alike with a silent, terrifying swiftness. The Black Death, later understood to be the bubonic plague, became one of the most cataclysmic events in human history. Between 1347 and 1353, it claimed an estimated 25 to 50 million lives in Europe alone, wiping out nearly a third of the population. Let us imagine the scene in a small medieval town. The day begins like any other, vendors calling out in the market, church bells ringing, and children playing in muddy streets. But news spreads quickly. Someone has died suddenly, bleeding from the mouth and covered in dark swellings, buboes, in the armpits and groin. Panic follows. Within days, entire households lie still. The smell of death hangs heavy, and the town's physician, perhaps trained in the learned universities, is powerless. The plague's arrival exposed the profound limits of medieval medicine. With no knowledge of bacteria or contagion, doctors struggled to explain or treat the disease. Many turned to old humoral theories, believing the plague was caused by an imbalance of the body's internal fluids, particularly an excess of black bile. Others blamed miasma, or bad air, arising from rotting corpses, swamps, or astrological alignments. One widely circulated theory pointed to a rare planetary conjunction in March 1345, when Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars aligned under Aquarius. Physicians claimed this cosmic event corrupted the air, causing pestilence to descend upon the earth. Remedies were devised accordingly: burn aromatic herbs to cleanse the air, avoid bathing to keep pores sealed, and flee if you could. Ceto, long, tarred, leave quickly, go far, return slowly, became the grim advice. Physicians donned protective clothing, including long robes coated in wax, gloves, boots, and most famously, beaked masks filled with strong-smelling herbs like lavender, rosemary, and vinegar-soaked sponges. These beaked doctors looked more like something from a nightmare than a source of comfort. They tried bleeding patients, administering laxatives, or prescribing concoctions of crushed emeralds and unicorn horn, highly prized and entirely fictitious remedies. Yet while elite doctors clung to classical texts and astrological charts, ordinary people sought more spiritual or superstitious answers. Flagellant movements sprang up across Europe, bands of men who marched from town to town, whipping themselves to atone for the world's sins and plead for divine mercy. In their eyes, the plague was God's punishment, and only repentance could end it. Others searched for scapegoats. Jewish communities, already marginalized and misunderstood, were often accused of poisoning wells or conspiring with the devil. In cities like Strasbourg and Basel, entire Jewish populations were slaughtered in brutal pogroms. No amount of innocence could protect them from the desperate need for someone to blame. In the streets, chaos reigned. Burial pits overflowed, and priests collapsed beside their dying flocks. Many cities ran out of coffins, shrouds, even gravediggers. In some places, carts rolled daily through towns collecting corpses with the cry, "Bring out your dead." Fear tore through the social fabric. Neighbors barred their doors. Friends abandoned each other. Parents left infected children to die alone. And yet, in the shadows of this horror, some began to take notes, literally. Chroniclers, monks, and even medical professionals began recording symptoms, survival rates, and environmental conditions. This practice marked a quiet revolution. The beginning of systematic observation in medicine. Though they could not cure the plague, they could study it. One of the most detailed accounts came from Giovanni Boccaccio in his Introduction to the Decameron. He described the plague's onset in Florence, how doctors failed, how social bonds disintegrated, and how a group of young nobles fled to the countryside to tell stories while death ravaged the city. His observations were literary, yes, but also deeply anthropological. Public health, too, took a leap forward under the pressure. Italian city-states like Venice and Milan began experimenting with quarantine, from the Italian 40 giorni, meaning 40 days. Ships arriving in port were isolated on nearby islands or anchored offshore for weeks before being allowed to unload. Lazarettos, early quarantine stations, were established, providing isolation and rudimentary care. In some cities, houses with plague victims were marked and sealed, with food delivered to the doors and guards posted outside. Sanitary boards were formed to coordinate responses, inspect markets, and bury the dead. These efforts, while inconsistent, laid the groundwork for later public health infrastructure. But despite every measure, the plague eventually burned its way across Europe. It would return in waves over the following centuries, never as deadly, but always feared. Its legacy reshaped the world. Labor shortages upended feudal systems, economies were transformed, and the authority of both church and medicine came under scrutiny. When the worst had passed, survivors emerged into a changed world. Some had lost everything: family, homes, communities. Others found themselves richer, inheriting land and property. And in many, a new attitude took hold, a mix of fatalism, hedonism, and quiet determination to live more fully. Art, literature, and even medicine reflected this shift. The plague had revealed not only the limits of human knowledge but also the resilience of the human spirit. Out of this devastation would come a new thirst for understanding, a desire to question old beliefs and seek new truths. And so, from the ashes of the Black Death, the seeds of the Renaissance were sown. Now, in our final segment, we'll explore how medieval medicine gave way to new ideas, discoveries, and revolutions in the centuries that followed. As the late Middle Ages gave way to the early modern period, the world began to awaken from centuries of stagnation in medical thought. The Black Death had shaken Europe to its core, and with that trauma came transformation. In the centuries that followed, a subtle but steady shift occurred, from blind adherence to ancient authorities, to a new culture of observation, experimentation, and reason. Let us now step into a European city in the late 1400s. The streets are still narrow and crowded, but the signs of change are everywhere. The printing press, invented in the mid-15th century, has revolutionized access to knowledge. Where once only monks and noblemen could afford books, now students, physicians, and even curious merchants can hold texts in their hands. And among the most copied works? Medical treatises, anatomical diagrams, and surgical manuals. But something remarkable is happening. Scholars are not just copying ancient texts, they are questioning them. One of the most important figures in this intellectual awakening was Andreas Vesalius, a young Flemish physician who in 1543 published a Humani Corporis Fabrica on the fabric of the human body. With stunning woodcut illustrations and clear, detailed observations, Vesalius corrected centuries of anatomical errors inherited from Galen. He had dared to dissect human bodies, something Galen had never done, and discovered the truth for himself. The human jaw, for example, had only one bone, not two. The liver had no mysterious five-lobed shape. The heart, too, was not the seat of emotions but an intricate pump. The era of dogma was ending. The age of inquiry had begun. Alongside Vesalius came Paracelsus, the Swiss-born physician, alchemist, and philosopher who challenged the very foundations of humoral theory. Paracelsus believed disease came from external sources, poisons, toxins, minerals, not just imbalances inside the body. He embraced chemical remedies and advocated for careful observation of nature. Though his ideas were controversial and often mystical, they laid the groundwork for toxicology and pharmacology. Hospitals, once charitable institutions tied to monasteries, began to evolve. By the 1600s, cities like Paris, London, and Florence had hospitals where physicians trained, observed patients, and even conducted autopsies. These hospitals were no longer just places to die, they were becoming places to learn. Public health measures, too, advanced. In the wake of plague, cities enforced quarantines more systematically, established boards of health, and even began to track disease outbreaks with rudimentary statistics. Venice, always a step ahead, introduced health passes to certify a person or ship was plague-free. Governments began to recognize that controlling disease was not just a medical concern, it was a political and economic necessity. Surgery, once relegated to barbers and battlefield medics, also saw advancement. In the 16th century, Ambroise Paré, a French barber surgeon, revolutionized surgical practice. While treating wounded soldiers, Paré discovered that boiling oil, once used to cauterize gunshot wounds, caused more harm than good. Instead, he applied a soothing mixture of egg yolk, oil of roses, and turpentine, and the results were far better. He popularized ligatures to tie blood vessels rather than burning them with hot irons. His writings, in the common French tongue rather than Latin, made surgical knowledge more accessible. Still, many medieval practices lingered well into the 17th century. Bloodletting remained common. Astrology influenced diagnoses. Amulets were sold beside tinctures. But the momentum was shifting. Microscopes, developed in the late 1500s and improved by the early 1600s, allowed natural philosophers like Antony van Leeuwenhoek to glimpse a hidden world teeming with animalcules, or microorganisms. Though germ theory would not fully take root for another 2 centuries, these early observations cracked open the door to modern biology. Medical schools flourished in places like Padua, Leiden, and Edinburgh. Anatomical theatres drew students and the public alike to watch dissections. The body was no longer a mysterious vessel governed by spiritual forces, it was becoming a system to be studied, mapped, and understood. And women, long excluded from formal training, continued to practice medicine in the margins, as midwives, herbalists, and healers. Some, like Louise Bourgeois-Bercier in France, gained respect and royal patronage, while others faced persecution, accused of witchcraft for their knowledge. Medicine, though expanding, was still not yet inclusive. By the late 1600s, the seed sown in the Renaissance would blossom into the scientific revolution. The work of William Harvey, who in 1628 demonstrated the circulation of blood through the heart and vessels, utterly dismantled Galenic physiology. His careful experiments, dissecting animals and observing hearts in motion, showed that the body was governed by mechanical laws, not mystical humors. This was a turning point. Medicine was no longer merely an art passed down from master to apprentice. It was becoming a science, grounded in anatomy, chemistry, and later, biology. But let us not romanticize this shift too quickly. Medicine remained slow, painful, and often fatal. Anesthesia would not arrive until the mid-19th century. Antibiotics, not until the 20th, childbirth remained dangerous. Epidemics still struck terror. But for the first time in centuries, physicians were beginning to learn from failure, not just accept it. The legacy of medieval medicine is not one of foolishness or superstition, but of gradual adaptation in the face of immense challenge. Through plagues, wars, and religious upheaval, people continued to experiment, record, share, and question. Every leech, every poultice, every herbal remedy, even when ineffective, was a step on the long path toward understanding. Today, in sterile operating rooms and advanced research labs, the legacy of those medieval healers lives on. In every stethoscope, every MRI, every vaccine, echoes the determination of those who once studied stars for answers or cracked open a cadaver by candlelight. So as you drift into sleep, perhaps imagine one of those early physicians, hunched over a parchment or peering through a crude lens, seeking not fame or fortune, but a way to heal the body, and, in doing so, better understand the mysteries of life itself. As our quiet exploration comes to an end, and the shadows of the Middle Ages gently give way to the soft dawn of modern understanding, it's worth pausing, just for a moment, and looking back over the strange, winding, and often bewildering road that humanity took in its search to understand the body, the mind, and the mystery of suffering. It may be tempting, from the comfort of our modern world, to scoff at the use of leeches, the chanting of spells, or the balancing of imaginary humors. To wonder how anyone could trust a physician who prescribed ground emeralds for plague or insisted that Saturn's alignment with Mars was the cause of a fever. But if we quiet our minds and look more closely, we begin to see something else. Not ignorance, not foolishness, but attempt. A deep, desperate, and enduring attempt to make sense of the chaos of life and death. You see, for the people of the Middle Ages, medicine wasn't just about science, it was about meaning. When a child fell ill or a fever spread through a village, people needed not only treatment but understanding. The leech, the prayer, the charm tucked beneath a pillow, these weren't just tools of healing. They were symbols. They told people that they were not helpless. That someone cared. That something could be done. Trust in medieval doctors wasn't blind obedience. It was often all people had. Many physicians were deeply sincere in their efforts. Learned men who studied Galen and Hippocrates, who spent long hours copying texts, who walked for miles to reach a patient, or sat bedside through the long, cold hours of a winter night. They listened. They watched. They tried. And even when their methods failed, as they often did, they laid the groundwork for future generations to try better. And the healers weren't always men in long robes or Latin-speaking scholars. They were mothers, wives, midwives, monks, barbers, herbalists, ordinary people passing down wisdom through whispers and worn-out books. They experimented with roots and poultices. They observed. They adjusted. And sometimes, by trial or sheer luck, they healed. The leech, so central to our story, is not a symbol of ignorance but of hope, strange, slippery hope. It represented a belief that the body could be cleansed, that illness could be drawn out, that balance could be restored. It's easy to forget, as we sit in sterile clinics today, that for centuries the body was a mystery. Dissections were forbidden. Disease was invisible. Germs were unknown. Pain came without warning and without explanation. And so, in a world of uncertainty, the leech was something concrete. It did something. And behind the leech, and the bloodletting knife, and the herbal remedy, there was always a story, a framework, a worldview that made sense of the suffering. For some, illness came from divine punishment. For others, it was the stars. For others still, it was bad air, or imbalance, or the devil himself. And while none of these theories would pass scientific scrutiny today, they fulfilled a very human need to make suffering intelligible. Because when you understand something, you can bear it. And so medieval people bore much. More than most of us ever will. Plagues that killed half a city. Childbirth that took the lives of mothers and babies alike. Wounds that festered, teeth that rotted, limbs that broke and never healed straight. Through all of it, medicine, however flawed, offered a sliver of control. A reason. A remedy. A ritual. And slowly, over centuries, something incredible happened. With every failed cure, a question was asked. With every autopsy, an assumption was challenged. With every patient lost, another idea was tested. Until, one day, someone thought to look beyond Galen. To open a body and sketch what they saw. To boil a herbal mixture and test its effect. To challenge tradition. To wonder if illness had nothing to do with the moon, but rather something smaller, something unseen, something like a germ. It didn't happen quickly. No revolutions ever do. But the seeds were sown in those candlelit rooms, in those crowded marketplaces, in those quiet abbey gardens where monks crushed herbs and took notes. And even the leech, primitive though it may seem, played its part. Because medicine, at its core, is a story of accumulation, of small steps, of painful progress. It is a story of people watching, recording, guessing, and trying again. And that story didn't end in the Middle Ages. It continues today. In hospitals and homes, in labs and in lecture halls, in the questions we still ask. Why does this illness happen? How do we cure it? Can we save this life? We still don't have all the answers. But because of the people who lived and healed and hoped before us, we have more than we did. We owe a strange sort of gratitude to those medieval doctors, to the ones who bled patients by moonlight and believed in the four humours with all their hearts. To the ones who trusted plants and prayers, not out of ignorance, but because it was all they had. To the ones who experimented and failed, and documented their failures so someone else might succeed. Because without them, there would be no us. Their world was full of shadows, of plague carts and pestilence, of superstition and sorrow. But even in that darkness, there were flickers of light. A physician's steady hand. A healer's whispered wisdom. A leech in a wooden bowl, glistening with the possibility of relief. So as you rest now, in the quiet of your room, perhaps your breath slowing, your eyes beginning to close, remember this. Every comfortable breath we take today is built on the aching lungs of those who came before. Every cure we celebrate was once a mystery someone dared to solve. And every leech, every charm, every chalk circle drawn in hope was a chapter in the long, strange, beautiful story of how we learned to heal. Sleep well, traveler of history. The journey is long, but full of wonder. And tomorrow, there will be more stories to tell.